Salam. Okay, this is going to be chapter 2 of the Black Jews of Africa reading. This is Jewish accounts and Christian traditions. Myriad interpretations of these passages frame the way for subsequent extrapolations connecting Africa with Jews. From this time, travelers and tribes seekers could plausibly suspect certain peoples of Africa to be remnants of the lost tribes. At the end of the 9th century, one of the most famous and most extravagant of travelers seeking the lost tribes was Eldad the Danite, a Jew who mysteriously came from Eastern Sahara to carry out a religious mission in Tiret, Fez, and Kirwan. Eldad's experiences were legion and fanciful. He suffered a shipwreck, fell into the hands of cannibals, and whereas his travel companion was eaten, he escaped this wretched fate by being bought by a Jew from the tribe of Issachar. Eldad wrote an account in a somewhat archaic Hebrew in which he explained that upon Solomon's death, 4 Jewish tribes, including his own, Dan, and the tribes of Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, settled in Africa. The tribes established an independent empire that dominated the country while remaining a nomadic people. Their kingdom was supposed to be in Havila, the country of gold, near Ethiopia, and the tribes, said to be of outstanding bravery, were constantly at war against their neighbors. Eldad also mentioned the existence of sons of Moses who lived nearby but were cut off from the world by the impassable Sambation. They are of perfect faith, and their Talmud is all in Hebrew, but they know not the rabbis, for these were the second temple, and they did not reach them. No unclean things are to be found with them, no unclean fowl, no unclean beast, no unclean cattle, no flies, no lice, no foxes, no scorpions, no serpents, and no dogs. And they could speak only the holy tongue, and they all take ritual baths and never swear. What is to be thought of the material of Sefer Eldad? Half truth, half make believe, it seems to be based on real historical characters and events, such as the conversion of the Arabian king Dunuas of Himyar and his subjects to Judaism, 6th century, that were embroidered by the storyteller. Nonetheless, one can think that Eldad's account, with its numerous improbabilities, he locates the origin of the halakha, Jewish law, in a Jewish community somewhere in Africa, had an underlying content. Eldad's aim was probably to reinforce the Jewish faith by giving news of Israel's tribes that live freely, and by contributing to the utopian dream of the lost tribes return to Israel. The story of Eldad did not lack supporters in the 10th century, such as Rabbi Chisdai ibn Shaprut, the vizier of the Caliph of Cordoba, whereas Ibn Ezra and Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg in particular considered him as an impostor. Much more recently, in the 19th century, P.F. Frankel denounced him too as a faker of Greek origin, whereas H.A. Reifman concluded that his account was a late forgery. However, the Hebrew account of Eldad was widely disseminated. The earliest version of Eldad's account was published in Mantua in 1483, followed by a later version in Constantinople in 1519, and had a long-lasting influence on the Jewish and European imagination in the Middle Ages. It reverberated in the imagination of both Jews and Christians the idea of the presence of Jews beyond the Sambatyon, and reinforced the myth of the lost tribes exiled in some distant utopia. In the 12th century, Benjamin of Tudela, 1165 to 1173, described as one of the greatest travelers who have ever lived, undertook a journey of several years that took him as far as China to establish a sort of census of the Jewish populations he encountered. He crossed France, Italy, the Greek islands, Palestine, Persia, and the Persian Gulf between returning home via Aden and Aswan. In Persia, he identified the descendants of the tribes of Dan, Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali living in the mountains of Nishapur, in complete independence from the king of Persia, and who told him, "We are Jews. We have no king and no Gentile prince, but a Jewish prince rules over us, in a place he names Ibrig, which has been identified as Ceylon. Benjamin noted that Jews, apparently those of Cochin, were black Jews. All the inhabitants of the country are black, Shehorim, the Jews as well. He also provided important information about the presence of a small group of Jews in the Sahara, in a country he called Kush, specifying that they undertook 50-day caravan journeys toward what is now Ghana, threatened by sandstorms, in order to bring back copper, salt, gold, and jewels. He described them as sons of Cush. Sons of Cush, who read the stars and are all black in color. They know the law of Moses and the prophets, and to a small extent the Talmud and the Halakha. Eldad the Danite and Benjamin of Tudela had famous successors, such as Patatia of Ratisbon in the 12th century, Obadiah of Bertinoro in the 15th century, the rabbis Eliezer Ha-Levi, and Moses Basula of Ancona in the 16th century, and their contemporary David Reubeni. All claimed to have found the tribes in a number of different places from Arabia to Ethiopia, and in others often difficult to identify. Among these travelers, some reported encounters with black-skinned Jews. In a detailed description of Jerusalem, Obadiah of Bertinoro mentions pilgrims coming from the land of Prester John, for example, Ethiopia, who told him about the lost tribes. He goes on to report on an encounter with black Jews, members of the 10 tribes, captured in battle, sold into slavery, and brought to Egypt. They are only somewhat black, Shehorim, and not like the blacks, the B'nai Cushim. A century later, while Moses Basula described the land of Cush in an enigmatic way, a letter from the land of Israel from Israel Ashkenazi to Abraham of Perugia gives the account of a black Jew, almost like a black Kushi. As we can see that they, as the admixture lightened them up, who was captured, enslaved, and redeemed by Jews from Alexandria. This description may be compared to that of the Italian traveler Ludovico Vartima, who described the Ethiopian Jews as black rather than any other color. It is difficult to know whether these encounters took place with black Christians from Ethiopia, said to have come from Prester John's legendary kingdom, or black Jews supposedly from the lost tribes. As to David Reubeni, who claimed to be the brother and emissary of the king of Khaybar, who ruled the exiled tribes of Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh, he himself may have been of Falasha origin. A number of his contemporaries, for instance, Daniel of Pisa, described him as having a dark skin. Quite naturally, the travelers and scholars who dealt with the issue related to the country where the lost tribes were thought to be, and the people who lived there, gave stereotypical descriptions of the nature and appearance of the Africans bound to geotheological problems like the climate theory. Unlike Jewish scholars in the Islamic cultural world, those in lands of Latin Christian culture in the late Middle Ages had virtually no contact with Africans except for travelers who, like Benjamin of Tudela and Obadiah of Bertinoro, reached North Africa and the Middle East, and a few scholars active in the southern part of Christian Europe. Only in the mid-15th century did black slaves from West Africa appear in Europe as a result of Portuguese conquests. A recurrent antique link took place between the lost tribes and the presence in the region where they were identified of dark-skinned populations. One might assume that a surreptitious identification between dark-complexioned peoples and Jews was made in the background of the myth of the lost tribes. Until this time, traces of the lost tribes were sought in the conventional direction of Asia and Africa. Following the discovery of America, however, the search began among its native inhabitants and sustained the identification of the lost tribes with dark-skinned people. In the 17th century, the myth of the 10 tribes did not lose any of its strength. Manasseh ben Israel, who was then the rabbi of Amsterdam, demonstrated great interest in the fantastic account of Antonio Levi de Montezino's journey to the New World. He devoted a book, Hope of Israel, 1650 to 1652, to the remarkable story of his encounter with Indians beyond the Cordillera passes. When he returned in 1644, Montesinos declared that the Indians who allegedly welcomed him by reciting the Shema Israel had a few customs that reminded him of Jewish commandments. He thus identified this people, considered as somewhat tanned but in essence white, with the lost tribes. Manasseh accepted this account, but rejected out of hand the possibility of identifying the lost Israelites with certain dark-skinned Indian tribes. He refused the hypothesis raised by a few Christian scholars that the Canaanites, black, according to the Midrashic tradition, wandered until they reached America after Joshua defeated them and expelled them from Canaan, and that the Indians were their descendants. He could, however, accept the argument, among others, that the Jews were originally light-skinned, but their complexions had grown dark as a punishment of their exile, which is incorrect. In the following centuries, the myth of the 10 tribes did not lose any of its strength, and a number of Jewish travelers or Israeli emissaries, Shelule Eretz Israel, brought forward proof that the desire for a confrontation between the present reality and the mythical past was actively being kept alive. We note that in the 1830s, of these disciples, Israel of Shklov, leader of a group called the Kohel Ha-Purishim of Safed, who wished to facilitate the reunification of the exile community, sent an emissary into the Arabian desert to search for traces of the 10 tribes. In 1824, a disciple of the Gaon of Vilna, David de Beth Hillel, began a long journey in search of Eastern Jewish communities, which took him to Palestine and as far as India. The sole reason that led David de Beth Hillel to spend nearly 10 years tracing the Jewish presence in the East was none other than to shed light on the existence and the status of the 10 lost tribes who lived in freedom and virtuously. One might add that the messages of those travelers served the function of keeping alive messianic hopes in the face of general persecution of Jews in Europe and elsewhere. An example of the amalgamation of Jewish and Christian myths and legends in the legend of Prester John, a supernatural personage who foreshadowed the return of the Messiah at the end of the days. This legend dominated Western imagination for a long time during the Middle Ages and tossed another stone on the heap of the myth of the 10 tribes in Africa. The account of the existence and the totally fictitious high deeds of this priest king spread throughout Europe and forged the attitudes of the time. How was this legend created? Around the middle of the 12th century, the conquest of the Crusaders in Palestine was seriously threatened. The Saracens' power had significantly increased, and discouragement overtook the Christians. Prester John was known instantly in Europe due to a letter he ostensibly sent in 1165 to the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnene. In this letter, which was the basis of the legend for centuries, Prester John described himself as ruling in India. The confusion that prevailed in the Middle Ages in terms of geography barely distinguished Africa from India, and the general ignorance prevailing transported Prester John to Africa that could be Asia. He went on to write that he was a Christian ruler and described his wealth, power, the great size and the diversity of his empire, and the botanical and zoological marvels that could be found there. Prester John's letter mentions also the presence of Jews nearby his states. His description strongly evokes the fabulous account of Eldad the Danite. Between us and the Jews flows a river so rapid that no one is able to cross it except on Saturday, its day of rest. The Jews are twice as numerous as the Christians or Saracens, but the great king of Israel pays us a tribute of 200 horses loaded with gold, silver, and precious stones. When Portugal began its maritime discoveries, Prince Henry sent emissaries to Ethiopia, where they found a Christian king who, in some ways, displayed features already ascribed to Prester John. Vague ideas about the remote religious doctrines flourishing, especially in Asia, contributed to the spread throughout Europe of the opinion that a powerful ruler at the edges of the earth was professing Christianity. The legend of Prester John was assimilated by both Jewish and Christian myths and legends and constituted a reference for 15th and 16th century Jewish writings. Obadiah of Bertinora affirmed in 1448, certain it is that a man has arrived from the land of the Prester John, which lies between great mountains and extends 10 days' journey, who says that there is the dwelling of Bnei Israel and that they are in continuous warfare with Prester John. In answer to this, another text known in Jerusalem in 1454 recounted that the Sambation had dried up, and that the tribes were crossing it to wage war on Prester John. We also note that the legend of Prester John drew on the medieval idea that the earthly paradise should be located somewhere in Africa. Later on, with the Portuguese interests being transferred to the Monomotapa Empire, believed to be Ophir, assimilation was made between the Monomotapa and the myth of Prester John. This is how Vincent Leblanc, a French traveler, used golden columns and other architectural elements to describe the capital of Monomotapa, as Prester John had depicted it in his famous letter. From the earliest time to the first conquest, the myth of the lost tribes and its plasticity gave weight to the world of interrelated representations, commonplace and stereotyped images for laying out supposedly historical realities. The mental perception that resulted divided the world into categories in terms of these stereotypes, closely tied in with ancient schemas of pagan or Christian origin that placed at the frontier of no mankind models of perfection or barbarism. The myth contributed to a European propensity to a binary way of thinking. The persistence of the myth owed much to the tension aroused among Europeans by the encounters with the non-European, non-Christian. The myth gave birth throughout these centuries to a tendency to invoke the lost tribes, to make sense of any unknown population. Isaiah's and Ezekiel's prophecies predicting the return of the tribes from the land of Cush provided an authoritative infrastructure for all future speculation concerning the presence of the 10 tribes in Africa. For centuries, Western Christians have lived in ignorance of Africa. What and where this fabulous land was a matter wide open for speculation. And this was the land, no doubt, of the original Jews. So give thanks for tuning in once again. That was part 2. We had touched on the Jewish accounts and Christian traditions. So stay tuned later on, Jah willing, for part 3, the mythography of Africa. Give thanks for tuning in. Salam.